Hello fam, today we shall be walking through Bristol, a city born from a single bridge, built into an empire, burned to the ground and rebuilt twice over. Let's dive in. Stand on the harbor side in Bristol today. You are standing where ships left for America before America had a name, where the wealth of enslaved people was pressed into the very stones beneath your feet, where bombs fell, the city burned, and the city rebuilt. Bristol has never been a safe city. It has never been a comfortable one. It has been, for 1,000 years, a city that lives at the edge of everything cawed and survives it. Because this is not just a port city. This is the city that sent a small wooden ship west and found a new continent. The city that ran the slave trade at its peak, then watched a statue of its most famous slave trader hit the harbor water 330 years after his death. The city that gave the world its most famous engineer fought 2 civil wars in 2 different centuries and survived the worst bombing campaign in the west of England. A city that has been breaking things and rebuilding them for 1,000 years. And still has not decided whether it is finished. Using advanced AI, we have taken centuries-old images, faded maps, and long-forgotten engravings, and brought them back to life. You are not going to read about Bristol's past. You are going to see it.
And what you are about to see is stranger, darker, and more surprising than almost any city in Britain.
A city born from a single bridge, built into an empire, burned to the ground and rebuilt twice over. A city that opened the door to the modern world and has been arguing about what came through it ever since.
Bristol has changed the world around it for years. In the next 23 minutes, we journey back through the centuries to where the story first began.
Nobody planned Bristol. There was no emperor who pointed at a map and said, "Build here." No general who chose this ground for its high walls or its natural defenses. Bristol did not begin as a fortress or a cathedral town or a seat of power. It began as a bridge. Sometime around the year 1000, Saxon settlers built a wooden crossing over the River Avon. It was not much to look at, but it sat at a point where the river met the tidal estuary, where the land route west met the sea route south, where England touched Wales across the water. Traders came to cross it. Then they came to trade beside it. Then they stayed. A village grew up around the bridge, and the village took the bridge as its name, Bristol, the meeting place at the bridge. No legions chose this. No king commissioned it. It grew from the bottom up, the way markets always do, because the location made sense to the people who needed it. By 1051, it is already in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, trading regularly with Ireland, North Devon, and Somerset. Wool and leather going out, goods coming in. The bridge did not just connect 2 riverbanks. It connected England, Wales, and the open sea. That triangle, river crossing, estuary access, gateway west, is the founding logic of Bristol. Every chapter that follows makes sense only because of it. Then, in 1067, the Normans arrive. Unlike other English cities, Bristol does not resist. It opens its gates. William the Conqueror builds his castle on the ridge above the river. He surveys the bridge below him. He leaves it exactly where it is. He knows what it is for. That bridge, in almost the same location, still stands today. The Normans built the castle. The merchants built everything else. Within a century of the conquest, Bristol had become something that surprised even those who governed it. King Stephen, a Norman king with no reason to speak well of an English trading town, described it as nearly the richest of all cities in the country. That was not flattery. It was observation. The port was working. The money was real. The Avon was not an easy river to work with. It ran 8 miles inland through a narrow gorge before it reached the city, and its tides were among the most extreme in the world, a rise and fall of nearly 40 feet between high and low water. A ship that missed its window did not anchor. It sat on the mud and waited, tilted on its side, until the tide came back. Other merchants would have found a better port. Bristol's merchants learned to read the river. They timed their arrivals down to the hour. They built their warehouses at the water's edge and their counting houses behind them, and they turned the Avon's awkwardness into a skill that their rivals could not easily copy. By the 13th century, wine was the main import, arriving from Gascony and France in vast quantities. Wool, cloth, and leather went out. The city grew around the trade, street by street, guild by guild. William Canongese, the greatest merchant of the age, became so wealthy that he personally paid for the rebuilding of St. Mary Redcliffe Church, one man funding a structure that still stands as one of the finest in England. In 1552, the merchants formalized their power. The Society of Merchant Venturers received its royal charter, an organization of Bristol's trading elite that controlled the port, lobbied Parliament, and shaped the city's commercial life for centuries to come. Their hall still stands on Clifton Hill today. This was Bristol at its medieval peak, confident, wealthy, and organized around trade in a way that almost no other English city was. But the river that had made all of this possible was beginning to cause problems. The tides that Bristol's merchants had learned to master were not the only threat. The harbor was silting. The approach was getting harder. The port that built the city was starting to work against it. Something would have to change. And then a Venetian mariner moved to the city, and everything changed. His name was Giovanni Caboto. He was Venetian by birth, experienced at sea, and by the mid-1490s he was living in Bristol with an idea that almost nobody believed in. He wanted to sail west to reach Asia. He had already tried once, in 1496, and turned back. Bad weather, a difficult crew, not enough food. But the Bristol merchants who funded him were not discouraged. They had been probing the North Atlantic quietly for decades, sending ships out into water that most traders had no reason to enter. There were rumors of land out there. Nothing confirmed, nothing mapped, just the persistent sense shared between men who lived by the sea that the ocean did not go on forever. On the 2nd of May, 1497, a ship called the Matthew left Bristol Harbor. It weighed 50 tons. It carried 18 men. It was roughly the size of a large modern yacht. Its navigator was Cabot, known to history as John Cabot, and it was headed west into open water with no certainty of what lay on the other side. They crossed the Atlantic in 5 weeks. On the 24th of June, 1497, the Matthew made landfall on the coast of North America. Probably Newfoundland, possibly Cape Breton Island. The exact location has never been agreed upon. What is not in dispute is what it meant. Cabot came ashore, raised the English and Venetian flags, noted the remains of a fire and the signs of people nearby, saw no one, and returned to the ship. He had just become the first European to set foot on mainland North America since the Vikings, 5 centuries before. He had done it from Bristol, with Bristol money, on a Bristol ship. Church bells rang across the harbor on the 6th of August when the Matthew came home. Cabot rode to London. The king gave him £10, about 2 years' pay for an ordinary working man. Then a pension of £20 a year. Then, in 1498, 5 ships and 300 men for a second voyage. Cabot sailed west. He never came back. Bristol had opened the door to a new continent, but the wealth that would eventually come through that door would not be spices. It would not be silk. It would be sugar and tobacco, and the human lives that were traded to produce them both. Bristol did not stumble into the slave trade. It campaigned to get in. In 1698, the London-based Royal African Company lost its monopoly on trade with Africa. The moment it did, Bristol's merchants moved. They had been pushing for this for years, lobbying Parliament, petitioning the Crown, arguing that Bristol deserved its share of the most profitable trade in the world. Now, the door was open. They walked straight through it. The trade worked in a triangle. Ships left, Bristol loaded with goods, textiles, metal, firearms. They sailed to the west coast of Africa, where those goods were exchanged for enslaved people. The enslaved were then transported across the Atlantic to the plantations of the Caribbean and North America, in conditions designed to carry the maximum number of human beings in the minimum amount of space. The ships returned to Bristol loaded with sugar, tobacco, and rum. The merchants counted their profits. Then the ships went out again. By 1732, Bristol was sending more ships to Africa than any other English port. In 1750 alone, Bristol ships carried approximately 8,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The wealth that came back did not stay on the docks. It moved uphill. It built the elegant Georgian terraces of Clifton. It filled Queen Square, completed at the exact moment Bristol became the country's leading slaving port, with the grand townhouses of the men who ran the trade. It named streets: Guinea Street, Jamaica Street, Codrington Place. Walk through Bristol today, and the trade is still written into the city's address book. Edward Colston, senior manager of the Royal African Company and Bristol's most celebrated philanthropist, gave his name to schools, streets, and concert halls. His statue stood in the city center for over 3 centuries. His name will come up again. The same commercial aggression that made Bristol's medieval merchants brilliant, the same willingness to find any route to profit, to work any system, to push past any obstacle, produced this. It was not an accident. It was a choice, made deliberately, pursued aggressively, and defended in Parliament long after others had begun to question it. Then Liverpool arrived. Deeper water, a more direct Atlantic approach. No 8-mile gorge to navigate. By 1775, Bristol's share of the trade had fallen to 10%. Liverpool's was dominant. The trade itself was abolished in 1807. The port that made Bristol wealthy had always been the wrong shape for the future. The city that had built an empire on the sea was running out of sea to build on. The same question that had broken Chester, that had broken every port city before it, now landed in Bristol. What does a port city do when the port stops working?
Part 1 of Bristol's story ends here, but the next chapter changes everything. In Part 2, we'll uncover the side of Bristol most people never hear about.
The hidden history, shocking events, powerful figures, and forgotten moments that helped shape one of Britain's most fascinating cities. Some of what happened here transformed the modern world in ways that still affect us today. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to Luca Reimagines History and turn on notifications so you're the first to see Part 2 the moment it goes live. And trust me, you won't be waiting long. The next chapter arrives sooner than you think.